tap the screen, share the live. Gonna get started here. All right, looks like we're live. All right, welcome everyone. So today I've been delaying this live because there's been so many things on the go, and a couple of ideas that I thought of to talk to today, I was like, no, that's not very businessy. So today is going to be a little bit more on the trauma related side, and we're going to focus on that a little bit more, and then I'll touch back and tie in some business stuff. So if this is your first time joining me, my name is Tina. I'm a happiness coach, and I help business owners deal with the emotional roller coaster of running a business. And so sometimes it's not your emotions that are the problem. Maybe it's the emotions of your team. Maybe it's the emotions of your customers, your clients, your vendors, your suppliers, any of those kind of things. Hey, Badril, welcome. So now, I share from my own personal experience, strength, and hope. I went through a lot of abuse in my childhood, and I was able to still overcome that and still do very well in a transportation and logistics career. And I share not only a trauma-informed approach, but I also share like change management practices that I used in corporate. So we're going to touch on today is recognizing how abuse actually affects you. And so this isn't coming from a victim kind of perspective. This is coming from understanding that there are good sides and bad sides to this, okay? I'm from Canada, Badril. So when we recognize how we're affected, now we all can react to various abuse in different ways. Maybe it was verbal abuse that we experienced, maybe it's emotional abuse, maybe it was neglect, maybe it was physical abuse, maybe it was sexual abuse. Whatever the abuse is, there's various responses that we may have, and no two people may respond in the exact same way. So it's really important for us to understand, how did you cope with the situation? I know in my childhood and growing up that whether it was the fights that would happen and the physical violence and the sexual abuse or the emotional abuse, all of those kind of things, they would happen. They number one, they would disrupt sleep. So that was a normal thing. Learning to function on very little to no sleep was one of the things that ended up being a normal thing, right? Another thing that was fairly normal was that you could have these very traumatic things happen, that these very emotional things happen, and guess what? You just had to get up in the morning, get dressed, and go to school and act like nothing happened, right? So now we know that whenever we are doing something in a repetitive fashion, we end up developing quite a skill from that. So what is the skill that you develop from a situation like that, where you're in repeated traumatic situations, where you've experienced ongoing abuse systematically, day after day after day, right? It's no different than going to the gym. It's like, okay, so you learn to ignore your emotions, you learn to turn everything off, and you learn to push that aside, thinking, okay, I can deal with that when I get home, or when everything's okay, then I can deal with those kind of things. And the problem is it happens again before you can actually deal with it. So you end up having this cycle of, you have the plus side that you have the ability to forget what happened at home, what happened last night, what happened this morning on your way to school, any of those kind of things. And then you go through the motions of being at school, and maybe you did it well, maybe you excelled For me, I was one of the kids that excelled at school because, oh my God, it was so safe. There was structure, there were rules, um, there was predictability, there was consistency. I thrived in that environment. Um, and then I would always get in trouble for coming home late. I was getting grounded. I would get more spankings because I came home late. And the reason I came home late is because I didn't want to go home. So there were those kind of things that kind of kept happening. So they develop patterns, they develop certain beliefs, we develop certain coping skills, and these actually serve us. They allowed us to survive. The problem is we continue those patterns as we get older, and like I said, not all of them are bad ones. So um, these coping strategies, that it's not something that you consciously do, it's just, okay, this actually works for me. Maybe somebody else, in what worked for them was to get angry and explosive and more aggressive than the abuser, and that calmed the abuser down. And so there's all different ways that we learn to cope, and it's important for us to understand and recognize the patterns of how we're affected, because when we get stressed, when we get in very difficult situations, we will default to those coping strategies that actually worked as a child, right? So this is why it's important to actually do this inner work. This isn't well, I can't help it, this is just the way I am. No, that's not it. Because when we're children, when we're going through those kind of situations, we are being victimized. We do not actually have control over the situation. So when we're lacking control and we default to those coping mechanisms, we're acting out a survival response, right? We're not conscious of it, and we don't actually have control. So healing is the process of excuse me, understanding what those patterns were and being able to take back control of our own lives, of our own emotions, of our own thought process, our own beliefs. And we get to evaluate whether or not we want to continue those things. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we do not. So these are things that it's not. Go ahead, Vibe, ask your questions. Go ahead, type those in the chat. So these are things that, even though you're going through them, and even though those are coping mechanisms, we need to be able to recognize, am I consciously doing this? Am I choosing this pattern, or am I just running in default mode because that was my survival mechanism? And when we are in survival mode, we're cut off from our emotions. And when we're cut off from our emotions, we two things is going to happen is all those emotions that you're not feeling are put into like a pressure cooker, and eventually they're going to explode. They're going to explode in anger, rage, frustration. They're going to explode into possibly an anxiety attack. They're going to explode into feelings of overwhelming sadness, depression, feeling completely powerless and hopeless. So know that just because you're not dealing with those emotions now, then you push them aside. Yes and no. Is happiness a choice? That's a good question. Yes and no. So happiness is a choice in that we choose the actions, we choose the perception. However, if we haven't done the inner work, then more likely we are running on default survival kind of mechanisms, especially if we've been through certain things. Because a lot of times, I know one of the ways that I had to cope is you just had to pretend to be happy. So a lot of times people will do those kind of things of just pretending to be happy, put that smile on your face, continue to do the things that you need to do. Because like I said, every day I had to go to school and pretend like nothing happened, because if you went to school, you were depressed or you were upset, then the teachers started asking questions. people started wondering what was going on. And the whole thing, the whole way that abuse survives and thrives and continues is through secrecy and silence. So if you are living in secrecy and silence and you are putting on a mask to hide the truth, then you can pretend to be happy, but that doesn't mean that you're actually happy. So this is why it's important to understand, how did you actually deal with the stuff that has happened to you? How do you continue to do that? Are you recognizing it when you're falling into those default patterns, or are you choosing those default patterns? So there's been plenty of times where I've gone through in work situations where it called on me to function on very reduced amount of sleep, and I actually thrive in that. So because I've had years of conditioning of being able to do this stuff, right? So understanding these situations and what you've been through and how that is still playing out in your life is like the first step of being able to recognize that, and then also being able to determine, is this the way that I want to behave? Because we didn't have a choice before, but now we can choose, is that still working for us? Are we getting benefit out of it, or is it actually harming us? And when we see that it is harming us, if we are not able to change that, if we are not able to make a different choice, then the abuse that we have gone through still has control over us. And so that means we're not healed from it, because we're not in control. We're not choosing to do this way, right? When we choose to take that back, and I'm not saying never go through any hardships, that's not what I'm saying. You can choose to go the hard path and know that you did something like really, really difficult, and it was hard and it was painful and all those kind of things. Any goal that you've done that's worthwhile probably required a great deal of strength and emotional pain that you've gone through in order to achieve those goals. But the difference between it being abuse and it being a catalyst for growth is because we choose it. So if we are running on our default old programming, then we are continuing to allow the abuse to affect us and have power over us. And if we refuse to look at these things, then that's even worse. Then we're in complete denial, and we have no idea how we're actually being controlled by the things that happen to us. But when we actually look at it, when we actually do that deeper inner work and say, hey, that really actually hurt, that really did fuck me up, that did mess my head up, I am not doing well because of that, and then figuring out, how do I take my power back from this? How do I change this so that this is something that is a good thing for me, that I can pull strength from this, not weakness, right? Some people honestly believe they can be happy all the time, never feeling sadness. Yeah. So yeah, you and maybe that's how they coped. Okay, maybe that's how they coped. Of it hurt too much. Like, we can't be too judgmental if people are in that mode, because if it hurts too much and they're not able to deal with it, trying to tell them that they have to feel bad or feel the sadness or feel anything other than what they're feeling is to continue to victimize them in some ways, right? So our feelings have to come up naturally. The best way to do this is to help somebody by providing them a safe place. So if they want to be happy all the time, we don't fight it. Let them be happy. And when they see that you're not trying to change them from being happy, all the time, then it's going to allow them to feel their real feelings. And they are now feeling safe enough that whatever feeling, because if you aren't comfortable with their happy feelings, you sure in the heck will not be able to be okay with their painful emotions that they're not able to bring up. That if you can sense that somebody is just pretending to be happy all the time and they can't feel their sadness, trying to force them into that situation is actually even more damaging. It is better to accept that they are happy, and then they will feel okay that you're not going to try and change that. So now they can start bringing up some of the more challenging emotions, and they can start expressing that. And they'll probably do that in a very slow way, to gauge, is it safe? Because if they're pretending to be happy all the time, then I can promise you none of their challenging emotions were ever accepted before. So if you understand sadness is inevitable, it will take away some of the load. I wouldn't say it's inevitable, that sadness is part of it. So we're supposed to feel a whole range of emotions. When we try to block any emotion, maybe we won't let ourselves feel anger. Maybe we won't let ourselves feel too happy. Maybe we won't let ourselves feel too sad. Any of those kind of things. If we're always trying to control the emotions rather than feel them and flow through them, because when you look at a child, they can go from, super happy on top of the world to they drop their ice cream cone and it's the most devastating thing in the world, and everybody, hates them or whatever it is, right? They feel a full roller coaster range of emotions. And that's normal. We don't think a child is psychotic because they were crying one minute and laughing the next, right? No. It's because children, when they feel those emotions, they feel them to the fullest, right? And we slowly condition them to learn to dial that down, to not feel so fully. But when we allow ourselves to feel those emotions to the fullest, whatever they are, sadness, anger, frustration, grief, happiness, joy, contentment, whatever it is that we are feeling that to the fullest, being fully present, it will flow. You can't actually hang on to those feelings. You can block them, you can ignore them, you can pretend to, you can delay them, but eventually you're going to have to pay the emotional credit card bill. And then there's consequences for that, right? And so when you have overwhelming sadness, that, and it's usually because you have a backlog that needs to be cleared. You need to go through some of that. And there have been points where you haven't allowed yourself to feel that full sadness. So, and when we recognize that the sadness comes from having something good in our lives, if that gets taken away or it gets removed, then yes, it's perfectly normal to feel sad. In fact, you'd worry about somebody who just lost somebody that they loved and they're at the funeral and they feel nothing, right? They're like, oh, yeah, we all die, so you'd be pretty concerned. It's like, are you okay, right? Having the appropriate emotion is normal, and you can go through a range of emotions, right? You can feel really ticked off about something one minute and then laughing your ass off. I've done this plenty of times at work, right? You get really frustrated, you get really angry about something, but then you happen to catch the eye of the coworker that you go for coffees with and you always kibitz with them, and you start laughing because they know what you're going through and you know that they know what you're going through. So it's kind of like a fun shared experience, right? So I actually learned to be happy and enjoy sadness. I like listening to music while being sad. Yeah, if that is working for you, it sounds like what you're doing is giving yourself permission to feel those feelings, even if they're sad feelings, right? And when we do that, it allows those emotions to flow through us rather than blocking them up and saying, no, this is a bad emotion, I should not be in this state. No, it's a normal state and it is a beautiful thing and we embrace it. Now, if we find that we're going to that as a default and we're just sitting in that, you may want to question, why do I prefer sitting in a place of sadness versus a place of happiness? Or is that just authentically what I'm feeling, right? So again, it comes down to choice and control and what it is that we're looking to do. If we're seeming to go on autopilot, like every time this thing happens, I fall into this behavior, it means we're not in control, right? And that is usually a repeated pattern from something that's happened before. So recognizing the signs, recognizing how we're affected by things so that we can identify, oh, we're here again. Okay, all right, so is this helping me? Is this where I need to be? Or is there something else that I need to be doing and be able to take that power back? Because if you don't actually have that control and you're just stuck into those things, then that can be a problem. Now, if the feelings that you're feeling are appropriate for the situation, then go with them for sure. So that's basically the three things that I wanted to talk about, was recognizing the patterns of understanding how we're actually affected. And there's gifts in being able to forget, being able to compartmentalize, right? And get on with your day, because it's like if you've got the kids that you're dealing with and you're feeling sad, you can't just have an emotional breakdown kind of thing and not take care of the kids, right? Because what ends up happening is the kids end up feeling like they need to take care of you, and that's a whole other level of trauma that they're going to have to deal with, right? So making sure, not saying that you can never show them that you're upset or you're sad or any of those kind of things. They need to see you go through that and process that, so they have a live example, a healthy example of what it is to move through those emotions and to be able to validate them rather than invalidate them, right? So validate them in a healthy way, and knowing that if you're feeling sad, you feel sad and there's reasons for it, but knowing that you're not going to feel sad forever, right? So when we allow ourselves to feel those emotions to the fullest capacity, then we move through them a lot faster. And it allows us to be much more present. We don't have an emotional debt that we'll need to pay off. And so when we recognize how we were abused and how that affected us, then if we're falling back into those default patterns, then we are continuing and allowing the abuse to affect us in our present life. And healing is actually identifying that and being able to take back our power and say, it's not that, no, I'll never do that one thing again, right? Staying up at night or having disrupted sleep patterns. It's like, okay, that's fine when we're choosing it. When we know that, okay, this next little while, it's going to be a bit of a challenge for me and I need to get these things done. So I am going to sacrifice sleep. I am going to sacrifice some self-care. That's a very different situation versus defaulting to, oh, I don't have time to take care of myself. I don't have time to sleep and I don't have any control. That is continuing the cycle of victimization and because of the abuse, right? So when we choose it though, that's a very different situation when we're consciously choosing it and knowing. And if you don't do the inner work, we will be a slave to our default patterns and our default programming. And a lot of times, if those hard-coded programs were put in us before the age of 7, We didn't really have a choice of what was going in there. We didn't get to question, hey, is this good coding that you're going to be putting in, or is this going to be garbage and it's going to cause me a whole bunch of problems later? We didn't really get a choice. This is why it's so important to do this inner work, to be able to identify and know what our defaults were, our default programming, the hard coding, and then we can work towards changing it. Now, that's not something that is an instant change, no different than computer programming. If a programmer realizes they have to change the hard coding, they're like, oh no, because that is so much harder to do. And that's why they also don't like to hard code things in. They like the flexibility of the variables, right? So it's the same kind of thing, right? So anything that was programmed into us before the age of 7, we didn't have a choice. We're going to default when things get tough. We're going to default to those old coping mechanisms. Why? Because they helped us survive. And that is what gets triggered and put in place. We run on autopilot on those kind of things. So it's really important to be aware of that, so then we can make different choices, right? My oldest memory is when I was 3, I grabbed a scythe and almost cut my hand off, and I laid in a pool. Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm glad that you didn't. I assume you did not cut your hand off, that you still have it, you're okay? And does this still affect you, vibe? I'm curious, what made you grab the scythe? Those are things that are good questions to be able to ask ourselves. Of it's like, okay, well, why did you thought it was a hockey stick? Okay, um, yeah. So those are things that you need to be able to identify why you did that kind of stuff. It's very different if you are grabbing it because you thought it was a hockey stick, or you grabbed it because you were trying to protect yourself from an abusive parent, right? There's a bit of a difference, and just even seeing all of that blood from the cut though can be traumatic for a child, right? As a child, we may think that, oh my God, I'm going to die, and we don't have enough logic or cognitive ability to be able to understand things fully, and we may make decisions and may put in our own hard coding because of beliefs about a circumstance or a situation. So example, if you see your parents fighting like I did, they always fought over money, and so a lot of times I felt the need to not ask for certain things. So I learned to not ask for things because I didn't want to cause more fighting, right? So now this wasn't something that I made consciously. It's just one of those things that creeped into this subconscious programming, and it plays out in adulthood when you're really bad at being able to receive compliments, receive gifts, receive whatever, right? So those are things that can end up causing challenges for us. I'm turning 33 this year. It's crazy how I can still remember being 3. Yeah. And see, that's the thing, is when you have an event with a high emotion, it's much more likely to develop that groove in our brain where we are going to, it's repeated over and over. And then I'm sure stories were told about you when you were 3 and you nearly cut your hand off, right? And so those are things, those repeated patterns end up staying, right? Because when we think back to our childhood, there were a lot of things that happened to us. Why are we only able to remember certain things versus others, right? We don't remember, what we ate in, July 23rd when we went to school, right? Whatever it is, you don't remember a lot of the mundane things, and our brain forgets more than the things that that we remember. There's just too much data that comes at us, so we're much better at forgetting. And so one of the challenges that can happen when we forget how we feel, or we forget what happened, or we forget that we should be upset about that because we're so busy pretending to be happy, what ends up happening is we develop that skill of being able to let things go faster, or we think we're letting it go, but we're really just shoving it off to the side. There's a big difference, right? Because if we're not doing it consciously, then we're shoving it off to the side. If we're doing it consciously and we're like, okay, these things happen, and I'm going to choose to let this go. It's a very big difference versus just like, oh, it's okay, don't worry. And you say, oh, it's okay, don't worry. Oh, it's okay, don't worry. And then next thing you know, you're blowing up because it is now not okay. And this is the 15th time, but all the 14th times before that, you said, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it, right? So what we were doing is we did have a feeling about it, we did have a situation or a concern about it, and we shoved it to the side. It's okay, I'm gonna let it go, it's not a big deal, all this stuff. And then next thing you know, you have like this one little extra piece of straw that gets put on the camel's back, and it just freaks out, right? And that's what happens with us. It's just that one extra little drop that causes the whole thing to overflow. And that's when the emotions come running out. And if you're having emotional outbursts, then I can promise you there's some inner work that needs to be done there. So guys, I hope that is helpful. And keep in mind that it's not just us, it's the people around us too. Whether we're the business owner, whether we're the manager, supervisor, or the employee, doesn't matter. These things will come at us, right? And it maybe we're in a good space, but it's somebody else's trauma that's acting up, right? Or causing a problem, right? So we need to be aware of these things so that we can prevent additional damage from being done, and we can offer the support to ourselves and to others to be able to help them heal and move through this. And just because somebody had a really bad example to be in the past, we have the opportunity, being trauma informed, trauma aware, and we've done our own inner work, we've looked at our own things so that we can help other people move through their challenges at a faster rate, because they now have a good example to follow because we have done that inner work ourselves. So this is something that I'm a firm believer in, and that it is possible to do this. And it's also good to recognize that when we're not in that space, to be that good example. So we have to know when, oh shoot, yeah, I fell back into survival mode. I fell back into my default programming. I fell back into this is the way I used to behave. So understanding those things and understanding what led up to it, these are actually gifts to be able to, but we need to be able to examine them to fully appreciate the value and all the intricacies and the details that are in the situation that caused the emotional eruption, or any of the emotional challenges that we're experiencing. So when we examine those things, we will have a much happier life, because we're no longer repressing, suppressing, depressing our emotions. We are expressing them, we're able to release them, move through them to the next appropriate emotion for that particular moment, right? That you can go from being super happy to sad, right? You can be like, oh, this is a great day, everything's going my way, I just closed another sale, I just got a new customer, all this kind of stuff. You can be super happy about those kind of things, and then you get notice that, you know, hey, your favorite employee has been trash talking you, and you're like, you feel betrayed, you feel upset by those kind of things. And so those are things that can end up coming up for us, and that's where the emotional roller coaster is. Or you could find out that the project that you delegated to somebody on your team was due today and they didn't hit the deadline, and now you've got to answer to some other people for something that you didn't do, or you're gonna have to take the heat for it, even though it wasn't technically you that caused the problem. But that's the joys of leadership, and then we end up causing some of those things that we end up having to deal with. So, do you believe in anything supernatural? How do you mean? Like energies, ghosts, demons? What are you referring to in terms of supernatural? Like, are we talking like Joe Dispenza supernatural, or are we talking Dean and Sam from um, Supernatural? It's complicated. I've been able to know things will happen before they happen. Okay, so like some psychic abilities and stuff like that. Um, a lot of times, people that have some t- I don't know. I haven't dove into that aspect. I'm sure there are some people that have psychic abilities. Sometimes what it is just like, for me, people think that I'm psychic, but I chalk it up to really good pattern recognition, and it's one of the gifts of trauma, right? Of being able to notice some very minute details that other people would miss, and being able to pick up on it, recognizing those patterns, and um, having a good correlation that you're like, oh, okay. I'd always say that I'm just a good guesser. But there's other times where I'm like, huh, things will come in a dream or in just random out of the blue. And so it's like, I think there's some things that maybe us as humans, we haven't explored fully. And maybe eventually science will be able to prove that we do have some capabilities that we haven't tapped into. Um, it's complicated, but I've been able to know things happen. I would meet my favorite artist just by believing without knowing how, and just know it will. I've met 5 rappers simply by believing and knowing without knowing when or how. Ah, yes, that's manifestation, right? The power of manifestation. Yes. I do believe that there's some energies that we can attract to us, and we have those alignments. And being able to tap into that and pull that to us, I think is very possible. Right? So, um, but I am not somebody that, it's something that I've dealt with more internally, and I don't know if it's a neuro-linguistic programming or if it's something else, if it's energy fields. Not a scientist, but I think that there is some possibilities, and if that is working for you and you believe that to be true, um, I know I did that. I really tapped into that, especially when I was in my 20s. I would have this sense of knowing this one time I had to take my car to get repaired, and it was I had to get a new muffler and something else, and it was going to be an expensive fix, and it was going to take the majority of what I had saved up for my summer vacation that I was like looking forward to, but my car broke down, and now I was going to have to take all of that money and I was going to have to put it towards fixing the car. And I was like, oh, great. That kind of puts a damper on some of the plans that I had had. And while I was sitting there waiting, I was like, huh, they actually had this contest. It was like a scratch contest that you could win the up to the entire job free. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to win that. And sure enough, I scratched the ticket and I won the entire job free. So those are kind of things that can end up happening. So putting those kind of things out there is like um, is really cool. And I remember a friend of mine always used to say that there's no coincidence, there's only God incidences, right? So of being able to tie those things together. In 2014, I said, "Yay, Wolf," and everyone kept asking how, and I didn't know. 1 month later, I ran into him at a fair by chance. Everyone was in shock. That is really cool. That is really cool. I like that. Thank you for sharing that. That must have made you pretty happy. So you can tap into that stuff even more then. So, um, yeah, so that is the training. So being able to take back the control, being able to recognize when what our patterns are, how we were affected by the abuse, what the patterns are, and what the plus sides are and what the downsides are, so that we actually can choose whether or not we're going into that default mode. And if those skills actually served us well, then sometimes we take those things and we run with those. Um, and I know for myself, there's been far too many times that I've fallen into my default patterns and got a lot of praise for it, even though it wasn't for my benefit. But I did it because it allowed me to survive, and ignoring my own feelings and continuing to ignore my own feelings was something that I got praised for quite a bit. So, and doing that too much ends up pushing you into that default doormat stage. So you don't want to do those kind of things, and that's why we have to recognize what those patterns are. So guys, this is the training for today. Thank you so much for the questions and interaction. If you are just coming in now, you want to catch the replay of what we were talking about, go to my YouTube channel, Coach Tina B 125. Make sure you click on the subscribe button so that you get notified when I do the live, and when I've uploaded it, then you'll get notified when the replay has been uploaded. Okay, guys? So with that, we're going to wrap this one up tonight, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow. Bye!